to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swindon Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss borders, war, and physical removal. Tim.
So this is a very hot topic, especially recently. 5 years ago, it was a big topic with the rise of Donald Trump, which sort of split the libertarian movement here, and you sort of got the whole bordertarian phenomena. And I think what's also then became interesting is, as we know, in the past 18 months, the borders have been very tight, and even Raisin Magazine has an article that's like, get behind borders here, get ready to live behind tight borders. So we saw lots of sort of international borders been recognized here. And borders historically have always been a sort of tenuous topic here with respect to all sort of political groups here. So let's sort of start with why this topic interests me. It's not just because it's a hot topic. I think it's a very relevant topic, and I think borders are very much related to private property, which is sort of the Hans Hoppian point, which is why we're including the word physical removal in the title here. So I'm going to sort of divide this conversation between two groups. Group A, those going out for a military adventure or emigration or whatever, and Group B, those on the receiving end of that adventure or military invasion or emigration or travel. And then the places it can occur is virgin land or non-virgin land, some hunter-gatherer society or agrarian society, or on the top here, some equal society, or even some superior society here. So, for example, if someone from Australia moves to Britain, or someone from Britain now moves to the United States, those would be roughly equal. You know, you could barter or quibble over whether Sweden or the United States. There's a great current affairs article about how in the past, states like Delaware and the United States have huge Swedish and Norwegian populations. Why? Because they were emigrating from there. Now, why would anyone really want to leave Norway or Sweden or those places like that? So what we see here is the emigration here happens for specific reasons. And it happens from this one society to another society here. So again, the actors within this drama of moving around and war can be states, tribes, charities, companies, monarchies, NGOs, IGOs, mega corporations, or them some operating in concert here. Most of North America was arguably settled not by states per se. People like Columbus, people like the Dutch East Indies companies, the British East companies were sort of mega corporations of some variety. They weren't states with a capital S. They're sort of private organizations here. So I'm going to sort of go back into why I want to talk about this now. Glen Greenwald, this is 2021 here. I'm going to show the fallout from the fall of Kabul here. Glen Greenwald on Twitter made a fairly innocuous statement here, which comes back to like why I think this is an interesting topic, because they sort of divide the libertarian movement here, and sort of why I'm going to take the Hoppian side of this. Glen Greenwald made an interesting statement. He said, "Leave Afghanistan for the Afghans." And that seems like an innocuous statement, but if you sort of unpack that statement here, it has a lot of politically incorrect baggage here for the non-bordertarians here. We'll say, can we leave Germany for the Germans? Can we leave America for the Americas? Can we leave the Dakotas for the Dakotans? Well, it depends on which Dakotans for the political correct people. If the Dakotans living before 1800, then no, of course not. You can't leave Dakota. Hashtag sarcasm. You can't leave them for them. But the Dakotans living the last year, they have no right to land, of course. For people like Sam Cedar and Ben Burgess, and for the modern left, the current residents of the North America are considered illegitimate. And this is a point that's also brought up when people bring up critique libertarians. They'll say that the current existing property rights are invalid because of some historical inequity or some sort of historical boogeyman here. Of course, we had Walter Block here discussing things on the topic of reparations. One of the key aspects is land distribution here too. So Glen Greenwald's statement, "Leave Afghanistan for the Afghans." The question is why is Glen Greenwald making this statement? If you notice, in the lead up to the Iraq War, you had people like Christopher Hitchens who defend. Now, Iraq and Afghanistan are different places here, but there are certain related issues. For Donald Rumsfeld, there are clearly related issues. You're gonna bomb them back to the dark, bomb them into the Enlightenment, so to speak. So over there, they can't actually there. They want to be like the 51st state of the United States. He wants to sort of spread liberal democracy over there. They don't want to do it. They want to resist. So in a way, the Afghans are kind of like the Dakotans in Glen Greenwald's set. Now that's sort of the politically correct interpretation of the data here. The politically incorrect interpretation here is to take this and say, well, are other civilizations allowed to have their own piece of land? And on the bordertarian issue here, for the right here, the Hoppians, they are allowed to have it, of course, but for the left, they view them as, and this includes everyone left of like Nick Gillespie, it's not allowed. So to me, I see this as a huge amount of incoherence here, And even on issues like borders are very relevant. Without borders, you can't really have a non-intervention principle. Many left libertarians like to, and as far as the left generally like to talk about non-intervention or isolation. America should stick to America. Britain should stick to Britain. But without some kind of borders, it doesn't make any sense. Why shouldn't America project its interest worldwide? Why shouldn't, you have open borders for the CIA, open borders for the mega corporations. After all, Bernie Sanders, of course, said that open borders is a Koch brothers conspiracy. Consider people like Brian Kaplan written books on it. It is quite interesting that, in a way, it's true. Now, I'm somewhat neutral on the border position here, especially here in the United States. I'm somewhat neutral, but I do in theory support Hans Hoppe's position because I think it's the correct position here. But I would say everyone else has a relatively incoherent position, and it's hard to coherently lay out an incoherent position. That's one of the things I'm sort of struggling to do, because it seems like on a case-by-case basis, people will allow groups, the various groups I've laid out, to go places for various reasons. Now, the easy answer is say whatever makes the sort of politically correct ruling class happy is allowed. Whatever isn't the case is not allowed. That could explain why coronavirus restrictions in Australia are okay, but having a wall in Mexico-U.S. border or a wall around Hungary is not okay. That the politically correct version perfectly explains it, which just relates to power too. But to bring that back in, to bring up our third line, the physical removal, borders only make sense if you have some group that's willing to defend them coherently and effectively. So, like in the case of Australia, there's a sort of a town that's split up between, I think, South Australia and Queensland. I forget the precise two provinces. It's like a town that just has it's a big city actually, and it used to be like a conglomeration, but today it's split. So they can effectively defend it, and they have the sort of politically correct reasoning to do so. But to go back to principles here, we see sometimes borders are okay, sometimes borders are not okay. So and of course, there's a lot of the Latin American leftists are very much against immigration here for the reasons like brain drain, for example, which was the East German reasoning why they wanted to keep East German here. Which again another thing that the sort of simple narrative explains it here, but it leaves out the incoherence here. So I like the Hoppian theory. I would say that's the most coherent. But all these other things don't make sense without borders of some kind. Now, you could argue, of course, that the current borders are illegitimate. But, who would actually what authority would actually have can construct more legitimate? You can't just infer some sort of Platonic justice council. Sometimes people will attack the existing borders of, let's say, Europe or the United States, and they'll say, well, California was once part of Mexico, and Mexico was, well, technically then it was part of the Aztecs, but the Aztecs probably stole it from someone else. Then it was virgin land with hunter-gatherers. As you go back to sort of the litany of rabbit holes here, you don't really, in the same cases for many land borders of the world, Afghanistan as well. You have it's on the borders of. The reason why it's called the graveyard of emperors. It's Alexander the Great. He goes back much farther. So yes, I'm jumping around somewhat. But what I'm trying to lay out is I don't really see any coherent theory with respect to borders, physical removal, and war, and the movement of peoples too. You have large-scale movements of peoples, like sort of colonization of Australia, colonization of the United States, and then later movements, like huge movements of Poles, Irish, and so forth, much later in the 1860s, 1870s, and Ukrainians, and like later on. And even today it moves on. We have Hispanic Catholics moving north to the United States here. And of course now we have Muslims moving north into Europe. So we have these sort of large movements of people. I'm sort of trying to construct what would a coherent theory look like, and sort of lay out why many sort of political actors, like Glen Greenwald, who I like, seemingly make those statements, but in other areas he won't make those statements. Swithin, I've been rambling on some about what I see as incoherence here. Do you agree with me that it is that the sort of general view, everyone basically left of Nick Gillespie, has a sort of incoherent, emotive view, schizophrenic view on borders, aggression, and physical removal? Swithin?
Yes, I do. I think an interesting case here is many to the left of Nick Gillespie will go, oh no, look at this cultural imperialism from the Western powers in the past. Oh, look how terrible they were getting rid of the indigenous civilizations of the Aztecs, amongst others. And then these will be the same people who go, oh no, the Taliban are really bad because they hate women, etc. So we need to beat them around the head so that they can respect women. And it's like, what? You can't hold both positions. That just doesn't make any sense. If you're going to make the case that, oh no, we should just leave the Aztecs for the Aztecs, as you point out, the way it's used is just, well, whatever I like is fine and whatever I don't like is bad. So I just don't like the idea of the white man going around creating his empires in the 19th century. That's bad. No, we don't like that. But when it's because they're exporting their sort of militarized Christianity or something. But when it's going to be at the surface of global neoliberalism, then yay, it's fine. It was good, human rights, and we all kind of support those sorts of interventions. So I mean, as you said, it's largely ad hoc as to what is considered. And I think the same with Greenwald, though I actually agree with Greenwald. It's like, yeah, well, let's leave Afghan for the Afghans. Okay, fair enough. But as you point out, should we keep the Florida for the Floridians? I think might be the appropriate term. Where does it stop? Where does it start? I mean, when you're looking about borders in this context, we're basically thinking about people groups. Although really, the question of borders is kind of deeper than that, because it's a question of what is the border of anything? Does only one thing exist, or does only particulars exist? Or is there sort of like things we can group together legitimately and have a sort of group existence which is different from another one, which is a more deep philosophical question. But when it comes to kind of borders in general, I think it's obvious that people just go around and realize, well, this place is not that place. I mean, even in your own towns, you go, well, there's this area which is good and that area which is bad. And it's like, well, okay, you've clearly created a mental border of some description. And then it goes out further from that. I mean, okay, at the base level, you could say, well, they're not my family and this is my family. Okay, that's a border and that's a people group distinction. Now, I suppose some on the left would make it accept that, although I suppose they may wish to have everyone raised collectively instead. And so, it'd be borderless because it'll have the the World Council who raise the children of the world, which could be a borderless version of child rearing, I suppose. But it seems to be the case that there's some sort of like concentric circles of borders of certain descriptions. I mean, the way that I have to talk about it, I mean, they largely do it in terms of culture. To say, oh no, well, the Taliban have a bad culture. But then that gets into the question of, well, whether they are relativists on culture or not. And in many cases, they aren't. Despite historically, well, as I say historically, I mean not the last 30 years, saying, oh, we're relativism, we don't really know what's true, etc. So you have that. So it's kind of like a cultural divide, but then of course, well, are we just all humans in the left's view, and there's no really essential difference, I suppose. But with culture, they'll have to focus on that. But then obviously as well, there's sort of ethnic and sort of racial differences, which will make a difference to the who you consider sort of in and out, which I suppose relates to sort of my interfamilial difference. So I think the question of borders is one of gradation. There's sort of like concentric circles of them. The question arises in the political sense is, well, do we think that people should be left on their own in a certain circle to do their own thing, or do we treat everybody, well, these central circuits do exist, but being human as such overrides everything, and so therefore we should have a overall governance of humans. Thing is, you could do that and set up like a world empire. But the thing is, though, for an empire to function, it's likely to then recognize differences in different areas. So, such as, ruling, India is not going to be ruling China, and ruling China isn't going to be like ruling Niger, for instance. So I think even if you take the position that, well, no, there isn't really any borders, what we really should have is like world governance. Even the world governance, they're going to have to make some distinction. Now, they might say it's a distinction and not a border, but there's going to be situations where certain things are going to be run or legal in one area and they aren't going to be somewhere else, even in a world empire situation. Now, of course, you could try and rule it as a unitary sort of world state. I don't have that would work particularly well. Also with borders as well, when I say distinctions and borders, to a large extent you might get to a semantic dispute, because the left would say, oh, well, borders are a rightist concept. But we recognize distinctions between people who are on our side and people who are against us. So I think a lot of the time the left will hide behind words when really what they're attempting to do is creating a border of such. But they would claim, oh, no, we're merely making distinctions. So borders as such and distinctions between people groups over certain areas is inevitable and accurate to what sort of presently exists. And yes, the left in general do have a woefully incoherent view.
You would agree that by left, I mean everyone left of Nick Gillespie, correct?
Oh, yeah, certainly. I mean, to be fair, I mean, you could claim some of the right have a problem with it. Oh, interestingly, no, a poor view of borders. I would say actually that Richard Spencer has a very odd idea of borders, because I think this is American. He has, although actually no, not because it's interesting. Because what I was going to say was generic white nationalism seems to me to be very much an American phenomenon, because they don't have the history of inter-white ethnic conflict as you have in Europe. So generic white nationalism doesn't really make any sense in Europe, because, well, the French aren't English and the English, aren't Dutch, for instance. though historically being the Dutch were allies. And so, yeah, he draws a border in a weird way, just that white people. And it's like, well, I can see why, not that the border is incoherent as such, but his idea of like a generic white state seems to be a very odd way of drawing borders. So, although in defense of Spencer recognizes he's drawing a border and is at least sort of possibly attempting to draw one coherently. I think the ones further to left, Nick Gillespie, would be trying to claim that they aren't creating a border, but are in fact doing so. I think that might be a way of characterizing it.
Your comments on the one and the many, to me, remain interesting here, because you're correct about, the EU. Before I go about one minute, the EU is an interesting exercise because the EU technically is not internationalist. It's a regional project of combining the states of Europe, which just happen to be the historical, Christian, sort of Christendom states. So Turkey's not in, Britain, Greece, Poland. They're all, Britain's not in anymore with a capital I. But it is in a way slightly more reasonable. But you are drawing borders, correct? And it's worth pointing out that United States borders early on were always question marks. This is a point where Glen Greenwald and everyone to the left of Nick Gillespie has a problem, where people when Walter Block will get into a debate with Sam Cedar, they'll say Sam Cedar will quickly bring up the current borders of the United States aren't just, or the current borders or the current property titles aren't just, and it's like, well, show me a country which has just property. Does China own the Uyghur, those provinces up north? Does Russia own the province in the east and in the Caucasus? It's not entirely clear. That's not entirely clear. So the borders of almost all states are question marks. And not only question marks, they're downright dodgy here. Actually, the United States has some fairly, as long as the Native Americans are physically removed from the question here, they're actually fairly Hoppian, in a sense, based on the settlement theories, and they're actually quite left-wing. You got to remember, the United States has long been a pressure valve for the disgruntled lunatic cults of Europe to move here, which is one, you have all these sort of groups, all these sort of breakaway dissident groups here in the United States. And also the United States has been a pressure valve for Jewish immigration, Slavic immigration, all these other groups here, and now increasingly Hispanic immigration here in the United States. So the United States is a sort of polyglot country. Huge populations of Asian here in the west of the United States too, and historically too. That dates all the way back to the sort of the railroad days out in places like San Francisco. So the United States has always been a sort of polyglot, I think that's the word, society here. But internally, it's actually quite interesting. But the borders of all countries seem to be dodgy here. So the comment that's oftentimes thrown at them doesn't make any sense here. Show me a place that has legitimate borders. I mean, if you go back further, the Aztecs didn't particularly treat its neighbors nicely. That's actually one of the reasons why Cortez, with only 900 men, was able to defeat them, because they used native allies. And the French and Indian War was fought against, they had native allies here. So the sort of doom and gloom story of a settlement is not quite true on the ground, as the sort of left likes to say it is. And even in Afghanistan, to go back to the issue of Afghanistan, a good imperialist generally picks groups that are somewhat sympathetic to the sympathetic to them and have negative grudges against the current ruling order. This is something the British did very well. The Americans don't do as well, but partly because and Neil Ferguson makes this claim that the Americans don't want to create republics in the American fashion over there, not imperial states here. So in that regard, those other societies don't. As you point out, there's a difference. Empire recognizes the difference here. But I'm going to go back to the difference point here. And this is where people like Mises and Thomas Paine, and I think this is actually one of the reasons why the libertarian movement split. One of the interesting things about the split is it happened because of Trump, but then 5 years later we have this sort of COVID crisis where we have really thick borders. I mean, places like Rhode Island and Florida actually had border control checkpoints elected in North Carolina. Even like those cities in Switzerland, I think, had hard borders. So, for all the talk about being open borders, it was sort of the therapeutic people, which people like Mises and Gillespie, trust the science, are probably more in line with, ironically. The science told them to close the borders, but they also secretly think, or not so secretly think, that those borders are also racist or imperialist. So they had no trouble using them. But of course, they were using them for a purpose that's considered politically correct, so that's okay. But I more want to sort of A, state the incoherence and hypocrisy of usage, and B, and then later on get it to what would look like a coherent theory. Because your point about differences here is a very central point here. If you take Thomas Paine's favorite quote here, that the world is my country, all mankind are my brethren, and to do good is my religion. And Mises, of course, has the liberal has no borders. This is from Mises here in his book Liberalism here. So they both sort of have similar views here. And Thomas Jefferson, again, has a similar view as well. And again, interestingly enough, you can look at country formations. They do have a kind of, they are especially the liberal states like the United States, they were founded to spread, the American way or liberty in a certain sense here. Now you could always say, well, that's silly, and probably the right libertarian would say that's silly too, and I might agree with them. But the one and the many is a very anti-universalistic point in a way, to say that to leave Japan to have its own customs, traditions, and way of life, and to leave China to have its own way, or to leave Sweden or whatever society you want to name, Afghanistan, to have its own rules, traditions, society, is a very anti-universal point here. Your comment about sort of have the children raised by a council, a world council of sort. I mean, in a technical sense, it's liberalism is a culture. Liberalism is a culture which has a regional. It comes from a region. It comes from certain parts of Europe and the United States, for better or for worse. So ironically, they're sort of just spreading their particular culture worldwide. So you made the fun of them. They're not really relativists. That's true in a way. They're actually universalists. They sort of want to convert everyone. I like Christopher Hitchens, for example, because I think he's sort of honest here about his expansion projects. Christopher Hitchens wanted to bomb them into the Enlightenment, so to speak. And now for all Stephen Colbert, early 2000s, big anti-Afghan war, anti-Iraq war sort of. His comments recently were quite interesting, to say the least. He stated that why fight the Taliban over there when we have our own homegrown Taliban? I find that in a certain sense he's dark, in a certain sense it's hilarious that he would state that there. It's a very Misesian point there in a way, and a Misesian in the bad way. The liberals doesn't have any borders here. Everyone's up for. Everyone needs to be converted to my creed here. So it's not really about protecting indigenous cultures. It's the opposite. Now, of course, people like Glen Greenwald, the best defense they can make is to say, well, for pragmatic reasons, spreading my way of life is best done through soft power. Okay, soft power. That's the best way to do it. And so hard power, we're not going to bomb. And Scott Horton and someone else was teamed up a debate on two neocons. And the lady that Scott Horton was saying, well, even if liberalism is true, this is not the way to spread it. Even if you think the Taliban are a menace, this is not the way to spread it. We should spread it with soft power. We should welcome people into our society. That was the person with Scott Horton that was debating the two neocons who were advocating invasion. And that's an interesting point. That's the best point you can make to keep them in the politically correct tent here. But if you want to go outside of it, are other territories allowed to have their customs, traditions, and so forth? Zizek was asked that question, and it was sort of related to some issue of marrying outside of your ethnic group in some, I think it was some East Asian, it was some Central Asian country. I forget the place. And someone asked him this question, and he said, "Well, this is a hard case. I can't answer this question." I forget what he answered. He made a long comment and just said so on and made a joke. It is an interesting thing here, because if you have sort of indigenous groups, this also shows up in the Black community in the United States, the Native American community in the United States, is, if they marry outside of the ethnic group, their language and culture will disappear to a certain extent. Now, again, when you're talking about the other cultures, you're allowed to do that. And this is sort of the victim culture hierarchy. Certain cultures are allowed to assert their cultural identity. Other cultures it becomes problematic. And even Slavoj Zizek would state this sort of hilariousness here. It occurs in the Soviet Union too. But interestingly enough, the Soviet Union had a more imperialist attitude toward it, wanted to flatten them. This has occurred in Crimea. This has occurred in Ukraine. Sort of create a sort of new identity here. So Swethan, I've been rambling here about the one and the many here, and the differences. The differences are an interesting thing here. I don't see an easy way out. Borders are an easy way out. I've studied this in our classical liberalism, the errors of Immanuel Kant by Hoppe's, right? That borders allow two groups which are antagonistic to, at least in theory, flourish, air quote, so long as they respect them. Afghan can have it over there, we can have it over here, we can have liberalism or whatever over here, they can have it somewhere else there. But that implies borders that are somewhat rigid to make it work here. So Swethan, what do you have your comment? Do you have any comments to add or any criticisms of my ramblings on this topic? Swethan?
I would largely agree. With borders, you mentioned Hoppe. It's interesting that the liberals, and I mean liberals in the classical liberal sense, say, they have no borders. In a sense, they don't, but they always have property borders. And one of the incoherence, as it were, from, if Zizek wants to export sort of liberalism, which is, Zizek recognizes some sort of like post-Christian morality, effectively. You then get the question as, well, what if everyone just voluntarily decides to choose that actually they won't marry outside their ethnic group, or that they will sort of like shun and like ostracize people if they marry outside the group? You're going to get, then of course you get the questions as to, well, is ostracism violence and stuff like that? You could go there. But it is interesting the way that the classical liberal does talk about borders, even though you could say that they're the biggest defender of borders, in a sense, in that, well, they defend property borders, and that's how we get better resource allocation and fewer conflicts. And so the question then arises, well, why not have borders in a more general sense, or to deal with them in another manner? So that's what I would say with respect to the liberal. And as you say, the pragmatic case is, well, we'll leave one area to do their own thing and you to do yours, and try and sort of change them over time, which I suppose you could argue is one sort of defense that you could say like a Keith Prestonite pan-anarchism does. You can have all these different communities and they do their own thing, and people can go, well, what, that one's actually quite good, let's copy them. Well, I suppose in that model you kind of move and go somewhere else, but it's very sort of bordertarian. And also with the border point, actually reminds something Hoppe said, actually. He said, well, actually having more borders and having more sort of like ethnically homogenous states would actually promote overall group cohesion and have less violence. Because remember, war between areas, apart from the magnitude of it, isn't really, you could say, that much different between within a particular area. Although then you could say that's not really a border position. But the point he was making was, if you have what you recognize as your group running your area, and they do things badly, well, then it's not the fact you've been scuppered by some alien force. It's not, though, no, if we're the good Croats, we're being sort of like screwed over by the Serbs or whatever. It's like, well, no, because the Croats are running Croatia and the Serbs are running Serbia. And so actually you can promote some more sort of international peace, as it were, via borders. And, of course, you can copy what they do well, because, well, why not? You can. And so you kind of get good multiculturalism in a sense. That may be slightly off topic, but I thought was vaguely relevant to what we said.
Swithin, I'm going to ask you a question. And make a short comment, and I'll ask you again. Should people remain people in general? This can be any organization. Now, of course, they'll say, well, armies shouldn't be free to move around. But should people remain where they are or be free to move around? Again, I can say, well, is the CIA open borders for the CIA, open borders for ExxonMobil or Royal Dutch Shell, open borders for the Saudis? I mean, a while back in the early 50s, there was a bit of a Israel basically kidnapped an ex-German who was living in Argentina. And it was sort of an outcry in, I think, Argentina, that they violated their sovereignty. And basically, like, you went over to, like, it's an extraordinary rendition. The United States does it all the time. Throughout the war on terror, they do it. They just capture someone in some other place. They bring them to, like, Guantanamo Bay or some black site that's not in the United States territory. Should people? So, and then, of course, we have immigration issues here. The politically correct left, everyone left in epilepsy, thinks it's okay for Muslims and Hispanics to move into Europe, United States. But they don't think, and in general, they say it's not okay, at least for, like, Puritans to move to the Cherokees' land. It's worth pointing out that would never happened if they couldn't have done it in the first place. And they will criticize for the United States for not being open borders enough, even though they don't really think the United States founding itself is illegitimate, which is an interesting little bit of a wiggle there. But should people stay where they are, or should people stay where they go? In places like East Germany, one of the official reasons, from what I understand, cited was brain drain. Now, I didn't process this like this, but this is, I think, in the lives of other movies, this was cited. They raised them. They brought them to, they fed them, they clothed them, and then you're going to run away and waste your talents in some country that did nothing for you. That's like a theft. You're stealing our products from us. In a way, the country owns you, and this is like a slaveholding argument. Like, you're running away from your master here. This question of should people remain free or move around, people have not been as free to move around based on sort of 2019 standards as they are now. This was brought up in Brian Kaplan debate on the Center for Immigration Studies. Brian Kaplan quickly said, well, quarantines only take at most a month. So that can immigration, but that just means that travel is basically kaput unless you can't have a month here. So historically and currently, do you think people should be free to move around? To what extent can locals say no? This could always come back to power. The Afghanis, the Pushtin, whatever they call them, Taliban was able to defend themselves from the American Empire as well. The Soviet Empire did a very good job at defending themselves. So maybe it's it's a sort of he who Aki, it's a very Machiavellian, Schmittian type point. He who is sovereign is who can command a regiment or of soldiers or freedom fighters or terrorists to keep the people out. This is sort of a pragmatic criticism of, like, certain borders. The United States can't really keep certain groups out of the United States because the border is too big and there's too much support for them. And that's actually a fairly good pragmatic concern argument against it. And actually, they're not that much different at all. They should be welcomed here. So Swithin, to what extent should locals be allowed? And I want to go back to the incoherence point. It seems like most people to the left of Nick Gillespie seem to be fairly incoherent about whom and for what reasons people will be allowed to be moved around. Medical terrorism. And there was a guy in Vietnam who was sentenced to prison for 8 years because he was viewed as a super spreader. He just returned, I think, from another place, and now he's viewed as a super spreader. And in places like Australia now, they have like face recognition. So if you leave your house, you're sort of viewed as a super spreader. First hit the hypocrisy incoherence point, and then we'll move more into theory about what ought to be the case. Swithin?
As I said, as to how you should be able to move and on what basis. I mean, it seems entirely arbitrary. As I said before, it's just whatever I like, we can. It's fine, and what I don't like, we can't. I mean, that's pretty much the long and the short of it. Although interesting, thinking about it though, with borders and the people left of Nick Gillespie, is that they'll recognise borders in America because the people from the South, they're all stupid. You have the South and you have the North and the coasts. The middle South, they're all stupid. It's the coasts where it's at. So they, as I say, recognise borders of sorts. To the question of movement, I mean, that's an interesting question. What I've always thought was bizarre with things is in England at the moment, it's basically really difficult to travel overseas and come back. But if you want to sort of, permanently emigrate to England, well, that's relatively easy. You get yourself on a boat, you go over the English Channel, and you let you in. And it's like, with no PCR. Interestingly, Afghanistan is a red list country, and you shouldn't come back from it because you shouldn't go. So I do wonder how they're going to deal with any incomers from the red list country. The red list country is the one we're supposed to, we don't know, we can't go to in any reason. Really, this is the British government's advice, or law, I think, in certain contexts. So I think we're like moving around, like travel and sort of like holidays and moving around and seeing stuff around the world is entirely non-problematic. For one reason, what is interesting, I could say I'm defending because I like doing it, but you see other cultures, but then you recognize you have your own, and ultimately it doesn't really change the way that any of these areas work, because you're there for a temporary time, you're not living there, and so you're not really going to change the makeup of the area. So sort of travel as such, I think, travel, wherever, that's fine. Emigration is different because it's like a permanent resettlement. I would say you probably, if you,
I would cut in here. One of the critiques I might get early on was that I'm sort of jumping around too much. But emigration is much more like a kind of invasion, for better or for worse, than it is like travel. Travel, you go there for a week, you maybe go there for a few months, you see some animals, you see some churches, you see some temples, and you go home. You spend some money and you go home. Immigration is much more permanent. I got into an argument about some left-wing economist was attacking Airbnb. And he was saying Airbnb was ruining cities by driving up house prices, making the inner cities very expensive. So this is where the Airbnb travel is hard to get into a gray zone somewhere between immigration. You see the laptop people expats who can work from wherever. They're sort of starting to resemble there, and that's another incoherence. So a lot of Westerners who find the cost of living too high will go to places in Africa or places in South America or Mexico. They'll actually emigrate to Mexico because they can find a town that's fairly secure, and they can find a cheap place to live, and they can do their job there with high-speed internet. The left gets sort of fuzzy with that, but I think there's a big difference between just going for a week and travel, and like immigration is much more like a permanent thing. It's not temporary. Would you agree? And please continue, Swithin.
Oh yeah, entirely. That's what I was saying. Like, travel as such is fine, even though currently the Western powers seem to be encouraging permanent resettlement of people from different cultures and different languages, but then making it difficult for you to basically go on a beach in 2 weeks in Spain. which seems to be bizarre. Well, it isn't when you understand what their reasons are and their motivations, but that's another topic entirely. But when it comes to like moving to a certain area, I mean, I think we have to recognize is that you're always going to need areas in which there is going to be a body of people who determine what the law is in a particular area. I mean, in principle, you could have it for the entire world. You could have the universalist human state, and they decide what happens there. But the problem with that is you can't leave, like by definition, unless you friends of Elon Musk and get on a rocket and get off Earth. And so you're always going to need some form of way of determining what a law is between certain peoples. And so you're going to require that to be in, well, I would argue that the best position would be, as I defended in when discussing anarchism at the right with Rick Story in the Warden Post, is thousands of communities with small populations, and they determine in that area what they do, and so some of them will let people in, some of them won't. Now and make it easier or less, more or less difficult. I mean, though you could then say, well, what about the ideal sort of anarchist community or non-statist community of like 30,000 people? What ought their law be pertaining to immigration? Should they let anybody in who wants to? Well, possibly. But the prize is, well, if you're invested in a particular area and you want to maintain it, you think it's a good place to be, well, it's not entirely unreasonable that you're going to be quite picky over who you let to stay there permanently, because, well, if you let too many people in of different belief systems and actions, the nature of the community will change, and so it will cease to be the area that you those people wanted to live in to begin with. I think that moving around should be relatively easy, very easy for travel, and then for moving to different communities permanently, well, it's going to depend on the area, and I could see why some areas wouldn't want certain people in. I think that makes entire sense. So in a world of sort of more borders, would you have great levels of immigration? Possibly not. Although this then brings to the question is, why do most people emigrate? And I think most people emigrate mostly because the places they live are bad, rather than other places being better. Now, some people do that, but most people, I think they have an idea of that where I am is not good, and because of this, I'm going to leave. And so this is interesting. It goes back to the war point. Why was it the case you had so many refugees or just migrants from areas from the Middle East? Well, they were being bombed. And it's like, well, I'm pretty sure you kind of want to leave if you're being bombed. And so if you had a situation where you have sort of a recognition of borders and sort of non-intervention, I think sort of as it were the the push factors, as it were, for emigration would nearly be as strong. And I am sympathetic to sort of the brain drain arguments that the left use. Africa has done historically badly in comparison with all the other continents. And it kind of isn't going to get much better if all the best Africans leave and work in Britain and the United States. I mean, that just seems odd if that's going to be the case. And mostly immigrants tend to be middle class in their countries. The upper class stay because they're already at the top. The bottom are too poor or too stupid to do so. And the middle ones move. But is that really going to be good for like Africa in general? No, probably not. So, and also you can see it as well in like local towns, small towns. I mean, you get this actually with the subsidization of like university. You really sort of messes up small towns, because all like the clever people who are the schools there, whatever, they get hoovered up by the larger university towns, and they don't really return. And rather than being places of production, they, to a large extent, just end up being dormitory towns where you go to work in the larger cities. So you actually get this sort of like emigration within countries, or even like cultural areas, you could say, which I don't actually think is particularly healthy, because you get very much like everybody gets concentrated in fewer and fewer areas, which I don't think is good sociologically. So I think that's answers your question.
All right. That does answer your question. The intra-societal movement is interesting, and it's a subtopic of the immigration and war topic here. I mean, because if you dial the clock back to 1863 in the United States, there was a fairly hard border between North and South of the United States. There was a hard border. It's no longer there, and that's because. But what we see is Northerners moving south throughout the lockdown, moved to states like Florida and Texas. Elon Musk and Joe Rogan famously moved to Austin, Texas, out of California. And then many people from New York have moved to Florida for lower taxes and other things. So we do see intra-society movements here for various reasons, of course. And again, the brain drain is a very interesting argument because the way in which there's a kind of left liberal and sort of left Christian here, which sometimes will attack sort of individualism. They'll say, Americans love to talk about their rights and their individual rights, but they don't talk about their responsibilities. And then if you state their responsibilities, then they also get annoyed that you're stating positive duties. So if in any other context, if you state positive duties, they'll say, well, that's terrible. Why do I have to do these positive duties here? Now, again, I'm somewhat of I'm an individualist here. So I'm not a right-wing collectivist of any variety either. Although I'm not going to go yell ooh yuck to them. It's worth pointing out the left has plenty of sort of collectivist historical tendencies, like not allowing people to leave for those very precise reasons. And I think the reasoning itself is sound enough. Whether some policy wonk could find the opposite conclusion on this is of some question. But I think the sort of a priori reasoning is sound enough that it is, the idea of moving away is a kind of drain. It's just sort of patently obvious. It'd be hard to deny it. It'd be hard to deny it. Now you can say, well, it trickles back. Sure, it can trickle back. But it could be the case that, you could have created something better there, and all the wealth, profits, and resources would be there. So that's unclear. That's unclear. So that basically concludes my general remarks on incoherence here.
And now I'd just like to thank everyone for listening. If you've enjoyed this, please share it with your friends and family, or anyone you think might find it of interest. And subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings. And finally, if you'd want to contact the show for any reason, please contact us at mindcrime@gmail.com. That's mindcrime@gmail.com.